Should things come together for Lenor Sellers in 2024, I think there's a chance that the starting quarterback for South Carolina's football team could indeed break a freshman record.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecock Digest over on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more right now as new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Happy Thursday to each and every one of you Gamecock fans out there. I hope that you all have had a great week up to this point. We got a couple different topics we're going to dive into on this Thursday edition of Locked On Gamecocks. We're going to talk about Mark Kingston, the baseball team. They continue to just pound away at their opponents down in Hoover, and they're going to have to continue one certain trend at the plate if they're going to defeat the LSU Tigers later this evening. We'll also talk about some recent comments that Shane Beamer made on the offensive line when he was on his last tour stop of his welcome home tour in Myrtle Beach. But before we get into all of that, I want to talk about LaNorris Sellers, and more specifically, the one freshman record that I think he could break in the upcoming 2024 season. That record is the record for total offensive yards. That record's currently held by former quarterback Todd Ellis, as he recorded 2,975 total offensive yards back in 1986. Now, if LaNorris Sellers is going to break a record that has stood for nearly 4 decades to this point, what exactly is he going to have to do in the 2024 season? Well, in order to get an idea, of what he is going to need to do, I went and looked at the average passing attacks this past season all across college football. Out of 133 FBS football teams, the number 62 passing attack, basically the team that ranked right in the middle in terms of passing yards per game, was Marshall. They averaged 226.2 passing yards per game. So what I did simply was this. I took that number, multiplied it by 12, the amount of regular season games that LaNorris Sellers is guaranteed in 2024, and if you do the math there, you get 2,714 yards, because although I do have some question marks about South Carolina's, not tight end room, their wide receiver room, and obviously the offensive line, they do need to take some steps forward this upcoming season, especially in terms of pass protection away from Williams-Brice Stadium. I do think that the Gamecocks are still going to be at least formidable in certain matchups through the air. I think that with Dowell Loggins, how he's going to cater this offense around LaNorris Sellers, and with what he showed last year, with the minimal weapons that he had to utilize on offense, he's going to find a way to dial up the right plays in order to help LaNorris Sellers convert on third down, first down, and continue to extend drives in these football games. So let's just say, for the sake of this hypothetical, that LaNorris Sellers does indeed throw for 2,714 yards through the air. Well, obviously, that alone is not enough to break Todd Ellis's freshman record of 2,975 total offensive yards. You do the quick math again, LaNorris Sellers would have to also rush for 262 yards on the ground. If you average that out over 12 regular season games at the minimum, that would be 21.8 rushing yards per game. And I also have to imagine this. Todd Ellis, because the thing is this, when I looked at these records, He threw for over 3,000 passing yards that year, which tells me that they do incorporate rushing yards, obviously, which also means they do incorporate sack yardage, basically sacks that count against a quarterback's rushing yards total. I don't think that that's completely fair, but that's just the way that they record it. So, with all that bearing in mind, think about Todd Ellis and when he played. Todd Ellis was definitely known more so for his passing ability than his running ability. LaNorris Sellers, he is a unicorn of an athlete, 6'3", around 240 pounds, can run probably sub 4.6 40-yard dash. I mean, he moves very differently than most guys his size, and he's got a cannon of an arm to go with all of that. So, when you combine all those aspects, I think that it is absolutely within reason that LaNorris Sellers could break this record. You think about how up-tempo offenses have taken over college football, at least running plays at a much quicker pace than maybe teams did back in 1986. You think about how much more complex route trees have become, how much more willing teams are to throw the ball down the field, to throw the ball more often. Throw all that together, there's no question LaNorris Sellers, I think, is going to break this record. I don't think there's necessarily particular games where he's going to really take a chunk out of this total. Of course, you do look at games like Old Dominion, Wofford, Akron, and Vanderbilt. You have to assume LaNorris Sellers, he's going to have good outings in those games. We could say, just for, again, hypothetical sake, that maybe he gets 375 total offensive yards on average in those 4 games. If he winds up doing that, then he's already going to be around 1,500 yards, a little over half of what he needs to break that record. And that's with 8 games remaining on the schedule. So, LaNorris Sellers, listen, I'm not going to say that 3,000 yards would be a needle mover in terms of the national headlines and everything, but I think that it's pretty clear. With Sellers getting a year to sit on the bench, watch Spencer Rattler go to work, get an idea of what Dowell Loggins wants to run offensively, with how Loggins is going to change this offensive playbook now to cater to LaNorris Sellers' skill set more so than a guy like Spencer Rattler, this record's going to be broken. It's not a matter of if, but when it does happen. So, if you want to continue the conversation, then give me a comment down below on YouTube or shoot me a message on social media. Which game do you think LaNorris Sellers would break this record? Again, he needs 2,976 total offensive yards in order to break this freshman record that is held by Todd Ellis, which he set back in 1986. Now, we're going to stick with football for a little bit longer here in the next portion of the show. We're going to talk about the offensive line. Obviously, a unit that a lot of people would say that, hey, if Sellers is going to have a record-breaking kind of season, the offensive line is going to have to play a part of that. And from what Shane Beamer said at his latest Welcome Home tour stop in Myrtle Beach, it sounds like the offensive line, they are taking the right steps to ensure that they have a better showing in 2024 than what they had in 2023. We'll dive into those comments in just a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Yahoo Finance. Wouldn't it be great if you could see all of your investment and retirement accounts in one place? With Yahoo Finance, you can consolidate your views from multiple accounts into one hub and have access to the expert analysis that you need to tend to your entire portfolio with confidence. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or you're looking for that extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data that you need in just one place. With a community of over 90 million users each month, their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com, the #1 financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. Welcome back to this Thursday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen, wherever you get your audio podcasts daily, or your first watch on YouTube. So on our Wednesday show, I talked about some comments that Shane Beamer recently made about quarterback LaNorris Sellers at his latest stop on the Welcome Home Tour in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Now, today, we're going to talk about some comments that Shane Beamer made on the offensive line, because obviously, again, as we all know, LaNorris Sellers, he possesses a ton of talent and special traits, which could wind up making him potentially the best quarterback that's ever played at South Carolina when you combine talent and maybe even potential accomplishments down the road. But if that is going to happen, you need to have some other pieces around him that are working efficiently. And that starts with your play in the trenches along the offensive line. South Carolina clearly did not have that last season. No matter how you want to slice it, you want to talk about all the veterans that they lost from the 2022 offensive line unit that they trotted out, or you want to talk about injuries. One way or another, the Gamecocks, they did not get it done in this area this past season. And it was a big reason why South Carolina did go 5-7. Not the only reason, but a big reason why. And so Shane Beamer was asked by one of the guys that was there at the Welcome Home Tour stop in Myrtle Beach about how some of the offensive linemen had stayed in Columbia in the month of May and what that could mean for the group, how that could help them moving forward. And this upcoming quote I'm about to give y'all, again, credit to Gamecock Central for the video that they made of these comments. This is what Shane Beamer had to say. Quote, "I think it's huge, and most of them did stay in Columbia. I mean, I was in the weight room yesterday, and I saw Tree Babalade, saw Ja'Kai Moore, saw Trevon Ball, Cam Pringle. We don't want to hold them hostage in the month of May. I want them to be able to get away." And Shane Beamer went on to talk about how, it was really important for this staff that certain guys came back along the offensive line. Veterans like a Vershawn Lee, who was clearly probably the biggest and most important piece of this offensive line in terms of leadership. Ja'Kai Moore apparently has taken on more of a leadership role. He's been in the program now, of course, for several years. And he also talked about how, look, you don't necessarily always want to have this concern, but when guys go back home, especially younger players on the offensive line, you go back to mama's house and you're on mama's couch, you're eating up mom's home cooking. And obviously, it's important to go back home. It's important to take some time away from football because you can burn yourself out quickly if that's all you focus on. But also, it can be a bit of a trap when you come home because, you might enjoy mama's cooking a little bit too much. You come back and, you've put on a little bit of weight. And so instead of coming back and starting the summer strength conditioning program in shape, now you're having to basically work out your way back into shape for the first couple weeks of the summer. And that's really frustrating for a strength conditioning staff and obviously for your position coach because that's a couple weeks where, hey, you could be getting better in certain areas, but instead we're having to spend the majority of that time trying to get you to burn off the weight that you put on while you were gone for a few weeks. So that is all very, very important. And the thing that I like about what Shane Beamer said here is he talked about veterans and young guys that were staying here in Columbia. And a guy like Cam Pringle, again, I talk about how it's easier for younger guys to want to go back home. Cam Pringle, home's not too far away from here. Comes from Woodland, South Carolina, just a couple hours down the road in the Low Country. But yet he's staying in Columbia to do voluntary extra work that's not required of these guys. And the other thing is this. Look, I know it's a cliche, but sometimes if you want to get better as a position group, you just got to be willing to put in work that other guys are not going to want to put in. There are probably elite programs right now, at least in terms of perception in college football, where their offensive linemen, look, they didn't all stay together on campus throughout the month of May. Instead, a lot of them kind of dispersed. Maybe they went to go visit friends or they went to go visit home once again. And therefore, they did lose some precious time that they could have spent, A, working on themselves and trying to iron out some weaknesses maybe they have, and B, getting building that camaraderie even more so with their now college teammates along the offensive line. Camaraderie is extremely important in the offensive line because that's a group that, doesn't get a whole lot of praise. You're pretty much the last group that's going to get talked about, at least from casual observers. True football fans understand how important offensive linemen are in the game of football and to an offensive success. But also, you're going to possibly be the first group that gets criticized if a team loses, especially with a guy like LaNorris Sellers behind you now, and with how he can run away from defenders. If he gets sacked, 5-6 times, people aren't going to look at the potential mistakes that Sellers made reading the field, or maybe him taking off too early. And instead, they're going to place the blame solely on your shoulders. And so, having that trust, having that camaraderie, having those relationships with your fellow offensive linemen, that is going to be a big deal for this group. Just like I talked about how Shane Beamer mentioned that LaNorris Sellers has exuded a lot of steadiness and consistency with how he responds emotionally to certain situations. You're going to need stuff like this to go South Carolina's way. It's hidden traits. It's stuff that we don't, people in the media don't talk about this all the time. But it's just as important as everything else that we discuss. If you want to get back to a bowl game, if maybe you want to even exceed expectations, maybe win 7 games in 2024 against what is now a much tougher gauntlet in the SEC because of the additions of Oklahoma and Texas, you need to have this kind of stuff happening. So, it's great to hear the offensive line is hanging out with one another, getting an extra work, and no, I'm not saying it automatically means that they're going to be better on the field this upcoming fall, but the fact you're getting this kind of buy-in from younger guys in particular, including true freshmen who literally just got on campus a couple months ago, I think that that's a big deal. And if you're getting that from the O-line, then I do believe that that will lead to better success in the 2024 season. Now, talking about success, let's go over to baseball for a few minutes because Mark Kingston's squad, look, they literally were limping, or I shouldn't say literally, they were figuratively limping into the SEC baseball tournament in Hoover, Alabama, a place that has been a house of horrors for this program for several decades now. But they're 2-0 now. They're in the winner's bracket, and if they defeat LSU later this afternoon, or actually this evening, they could potentially play themselves into basically the semifinals for the SEC tournament, which probably no one saw coming when this week had started. So, what is the one thing that this team is going to have to do, particularly at the plate, if they want to defeat LSU this evening? I'll discuss that one trend in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. The Dallas Mavericks got a massive win over the Minnesota Timberwolves in Game 1 of the Western Conference Finals on Wednesday night, which means that it might change your thinking on just how long that series is going to take place. So, if you think this series is going to go 6 games, right now FanDuel has set the odds at plus 170. If you think now it's going to go 7 games, the odds are set at plus 210. So either way, if you think this series is going to be dragged out a bit longer than you originally anticipated, you can make some big money right now on FanDuel. So go check out the prop bet for exact total games in the Dallas-Minnesota series. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in 30 minutes or less. Let's talk a little bit of baseball here now, as South Carolina is in the winner's bracket, and they will play later this evening against the LSU Tigers, who, just like the Gamecocks, didn't have a great start to conference play, had a really rough stretch, and then got things going later on in the regular season, and they are scorching hot with what they've done so far in Hoover. Now, If the Gamecocks are going to defeat LSU tonight, there's one particular trend that they have performed at the plate recently that I think is going to have to take place once again this evening, and that is them scoring early in these contests. By the end of the third inning against Alabama in the first round, South Carolina was up 6-2. By the end of the third inning against Arkansas yesterday afternoon, the Gamecocks were up 2-1. Obviously, it's not inning games, so facing teams from the SEC, the toughest conference by far in all of college baseball, you might not feel like any lead is safe, but it is nice for a team like South Carolina to play ahead and have sort of that confidence boost that you can indeed win these games. And I think particularly against Arkansas, it was a big deal for them to get a couple of early runs against a team that possesses one of the best pitching staffs in the entire sport. Now, you might be sitting there wondering, Andrew, why is it that South Carolina has to do this again against LSU this evening? The reason why is this. The Tigers, as I mentioned earlier, they have been playing phenomenal baseball so far in the SEC tournament. They won their first round game against Georgia 9-1. They then turned around and took on the Kentucky Wildcats in the first part of the double elimination round. They defeated the Wildcats 11-0. They gave a one hit, and I believe they hit 2 grand slams to boot at the plate. So, the reason why I bring up those 2 games is because the way those games played out, LSU did not have to use many pitchers. They only used 4 arms in those 2 games combined, whereas South Carolina, in their 2 games against Alabama and, I'm blanking right now, Arkansas. In those 2 games, South Carolina had to use 6 pitchers. So, based on that, and you look at the stats for LSU pitching-wise, they've got a lot more depth than South Carolina. South Carolina, this is going to be the first game, I should say, where Mark Kingston and the staff, and probably a good amount of fans, you're going to be sweating this one out a little bit because there's not going to be, I would say, obvious answers in terms of which guys do you throw out there on the mound in certain pitching situations. This is where you've got the tail end of the guys in the bullpen that you still trust to go out there and they can make plays, but they haven't quite been consistent this year. And now you're going to need them to find a way to flip that switch and have some of their better performances on the year this evening against the LSU Tigers. So, because of that, the offense is going to have to pitch in this game. And I think that if you are Cole Messina, Ethan Petrie, and the rest of that lineup, the thing that you've got to basically decide is, look, we can't try to wait until the 7th, 8th, 9th inning to score our runs. We've got to pounce on this LSU Tiger pitching staff early. We got to knock some of these guys out of the game. We got to get them rattled. We got to get them throwing a bunch of arms out there because even if you beat LSU today, you could potentially face them again down the line in the semifinals, essentially. So, you've got to play a bit of the long game here as well if you're Mark Kingston and the Gamecocks. So, that's the main objective that they're going to have to accomplish. And LSU, when you look at their batting lineup, they are a power-hitting lineup. They're not exactly great in terms of consistently putting the ball in play, but they also are one of the better teams in the conference when it comes to doubles, triples, home runs. They're pretty much like top half of the league in all 3 categories with what they've done in conference play alone. So, you're going to have to get something from this batting lineup if you're South Carolina early. Now, one way that they could do that is by playing a bit of small ball in this game, bunting early and often, and also finding ways to snag some extra bases that maybe, don't happen because of what you do necessarily. Here's what I mean by that. LSU, to start off with the sacrifice bunts, they have given up the second highest amount of sack bunts in SEC play, giving up 13 of them. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that can play into a stat like that, but the way that I interpret that is essentially the corner infielders might not exactly be the best when it comes to those bang-bang plays in situations where you're trying to throw a runner out potentially on the run. So, for guys like, say, a Parker Nolan, a Blake Jackson, a couple other guys in this lineup, maybe a Talmadge LeCroy, this is a game where if I'm Mark Kingston and Monty Lee, I am looking to, maybe get a runner on with no outs, and then, hey, if one of those guys is coming up next, don't be afraid to try to bunt. let's test this defense out a little bit. You don't have to get extra base hits and home runs. You don't have to try to play LSU's game. You could try and play a bit of a different game. Stress them in another way. And playing some small ball here might be the way to do it. Also, sticking with LSU's fielding ability for a second, they have the second lowest amount of double plays turned in conference play to this point in the season. Again, multiple different factors potentially playing a role there, but you have to assume that part of the reason that that's the case is because LSU struggles in those high-pressure situations where they got to make throws on a dime. So, this goes along with the same theme. Continue to stress the Tigers in different ways than maybe they're going to try to stress you. The last thing I will say here, LSU's pitching staff, to go back to them real quick. This is a solid pitching staff in terms of striking guys out. I believe that they were third in league play in strikeouts, number one in league play in strikeouts looking. Basically meaning the batter didn't even swing at the ball. What that tells me is this. LSU's pitching staff has a bunch of guys that's got nasty stuff. A lot of movement, probably vertical and horizontal, depending on who's out there on the mound. But what it also tells me is this. If they are commanding their pitches, then it could be a long day for South Carolina's batting lineup. But when they make a mistake, it could also reap massive benefits because LSU leads the league in wild pitches in SEC play. So that goes back to, again, if they miss wildly. So if you're South Carolina, you need to be attentive if you're on the base pads today. Obviously, not every guy in South Carolina's lineup is a burner in terms of their speed, but the guys that can handle it, guys like an Austin Bringling, Blake Jackson, other players as well. This might be a game where maybe, hey, if Lee Croy isn't doing so hot in the batting lineup, halfway through, don't be afraid to put Will Tippett out there. I get the stats don't look great for Will Tippett, but I thought that he was doing a lot better at the plate before he got concussed and basically knocked out of play for a couple weeks. And Tippett is a better overall athlete, better fielder, in my opinion. So, point being, Mark Kingston and Monty Lee find different ways to get bases. Play a little bit of Kentucky ball, honestly. You might not like me saying that, but that's exactly the way that Kentucky beats teams. And guess what? Kentucky won a share of the SEC regular season championship this year playing that way. So why not try to do the same thing to LSU later tonight? It could end up being the difference in you winning or losing this game. So, with that all being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Hope that y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show as always. What are your thoughts on the potential for LaNorris Sellers to etch his name into the record books? Do you think he could break the total offensive yardage record for freshmen, or do you think there's another record that he could break? What are your thoughts on the offensive lineman getting some extra work in during the month of May? And lastly, what do you think South Carolina has to do tonight if they want to beat LSU? Besides score more runs than them at the end of 9 innings. If somebody says that in the comments, I swear I will flip my top. Let me know down below in the comments section if you watch today's show on YouTube. Or, again, you can shoot me a direct message on X at @A_line_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. As always, thank you guys so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Thursday. And I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.